Hello, welcome. Today's lecture is on the art of summarizing, and I like to throw in and paraphrasing because, as the chapter says, and I say, they consider paraphrasing part of summarizing because both of them are just utilizing other people's words, basically translating somebody else's words and ideas into your own, yet still acknowledging and giving them credit. So what struck me from this chapter, and it popped up twice, as you can see, both at the beginning of the chapter and then a little bit later, is that they talk about summary. So generally speaking, a summary must at once be true to what the original author says, while also emphasizing those aspects of what the author says that interest you, the writer. Okay, great. So what we get from this quote is that a summary, you must be honest and fair with what the original author said, but also emphasize what relates to you and your topic. So let's see, for example, if an author is talking about trees, but I only want to talk about specifically pine trees. So I would summarize the original author's argument about how trees are important to the environment and provide shade. And then I would say, I'd also emphasize, but specifically pine trees. Let's talk about the benefits of pine and how you don't have to rake leaves in the fall, or you can use them for decoration around the holidays. And maybe birds particularly love them because there's a lot of dense foliage. I don't know, whatever it might be. So I'm being honest and true to what the original author said about trees, but I'm emphasizing the aspect that is of interest to me, which is the pine tree. All right, so a little bit later then, we also have a quote. A good summary, in other words, has a focus or spin that allows the summary to fit with your own agenda while still being true to the text you are summarizing. Interesting. Okay, so that takes the original quote one step further. So not only does it emphasize what I'm interested in, but it focuses or allows the original author's words to fit within my own agenda. That almost sounds contradictory. It almost sounds like what they're asking for is an unbiased, but then biased summary. So what does that mean? Let's talk about that a little bit further. So our authors recommend that we put ourselves in somebody else's shoes, but we do so honestly and fairly. And those are really key to summarizing. They call it playing the believing game. I always think when you say it like that, I think of, either reading science fiction or where you have to kind of, suspend reality, suspend your whole entire knowledge of this world, your society, your family, whatever it might be, and you step into a whole new world where there's different rules, different expectations, different morals. It's not as extreme as that, of course, but that's kind of what they're hinting at when they say play the believing game, because sometimes stepping into somebody else's shoes can be as different or as wild as stepping into a whole foreign galaxy, right? So that's kind of what they're hinting at, is that we need to be able to suspend our own reality and understanding of the world in order to step into somebody else's shoes and try to understand how they see the world. And with a good summary, as they say, your readers then, so we kind of have a chain of readers. You're reading somebody else's writing, but then somebody is reading yours. So you're kind of in the middle, right? You want to make sure that your readers don't know your thoughts on this summary, but they just know the original author's ideas. So you're not projecting a really strong opinion on this summary. It's really easy to see in emotionally charged language, right? If you say, so-and-so, my instructor Elizabeth was talking about trees and stupid trees and how, they can be useful to the environment, but nobody really cares about that stuff. So you did hit on one of the examples I used, and you kind of summarized it, but you didn't do so fairly. You didn't kind of step into my shoes to try to understand why I like trees and why trees are so important. And so that relates to what kind of a bad summary might look like. So let's start there. So if you don't play this believing game, you might end up with a bad summary or a summary that is biased or unfair, maybe based on preconceived notions. It might be what the book calls hasty or short, where you take a whole, paragraph or a whole chapter of an argument, and you're like, yeah, she just talks about trees. Okay, so that's a very hasty and short summary of what would be a complex argument about why we need to plant more trees to help the environment, to help our own, utility and energy bills, to make the earth cleaner, etc., right? If you boil all that down to just, well, she talks about trees, that's a really short and hasty summary of what I'm talking about. Or you might use the closest cliche. So if I'm talking about planting trees to save the environment, you might just say, oh, she's one of those green freaks. Or, so what you're saying is that I should get a Prius, and I should, live off the land and not have plastic waste. So let's break that down then. So the closest to cliche in this example is that that's not what I mean. That's not what the author means. But you're relating it to a very familiar cliche that you're aware of. So when we talk about anything environment related, there's a lot of cliches that involve, crazy hippies or people that are screaming about the environment and really, angry or upset. And so that's where you could go with your summary, is relate my discussion of planting trees to better the earth and better our own personal lives. You might just relate that to the closest cliche of, oh yeah, she's an environmental nut. She wants to control everything about our lives to make it environmentally friendly, which is not actually what I'm talking about at all. And this gets very dangerous because then typically you're boiling down a complex argument into a single idea, which some of you might recognize as a straw man logical fallacy. So what a straw man fallacy is where you either wildly misinterpret or boil down a complex argument of an opposing viewpoint into a single sentence or idea or cliche, so it looks completely ridiculous and easy to refute. So our comic here says one person is arguing on the left that we should liberalize the law on marijuana. So that could mean maybe for those that went to jail for a marijuana conviction in states where it's now legal, maybe we should revisit those convictions and overturn it because now they're basically in jail for something that is legal now. Or it might mean, letting some states allowing medical marijuana, or we don't know what this liberalizing is because it's a comic, but they're talking about maybe taking a step towards relaxing a law on marijuana. But the person on the right refutes that by saying, absolutely no way. Unlimited access to drugs would contribute to massive increase of drug abuse. So what the person on the right did was took an argument that can be hard to refute or easy to refute, depending on where you stand, obviously. But right, the person on the left has an argument that is up for debate and can be discussed and argued back and forth. The person on the right boiled that down to a cliche and a crazy, wild viewpoint that, we should just have unlimited access to any and all drugs. Well, obviously, that's bad. There are controlled substances for a reason. So then it makes that argument or that summary very easy to refute, right? If you wildly misinterpret it or relate it to a cliche that makes sense, going back to our environment, my tree example that I'm just an environmental nut. That's a cliche that exists, but that's not actually what my argument is. And so that results in a very bad and unfair summary. So I also then added to what the chapter talks about. When they say, put yourself in somebody else's shoes, they just say, know where you're going. I also say, make sure to keep yourself in your own shoes so that you know where you're headed towards, where you're walking to. These boots are made for walking, if you will. So why do we want to do that? Because as our book says, a good summary, has a focus or a spin that relates to our own ideas and agendas as well. Okay, so we don't want to just be using a text source because it's our text source. We need to throw in some summaries. We want to make sure it relates to the argument that we are trying to make. This ties in well with previous chapters about the they say and I say pairs. So you always want to make sure you pair something they say, so a summary of what they say, paired with an argument that I say. So they say that we should plant trees because it's good for the environment. And then while I agree with that, I say we should also plant trees because it will help lower your energy bill, both in the summer and the winter. So you can see how I related their summary to something I also want to say. So for example, they say all about environmental benefits. I'm saying all about the financial benefits, maybe, of planting trees. And if you focus your summary this way, you can avoid another summary that tends to be not so great, which are list summaries. And this is basically where you go through an author's text and you'll say, okay, well, he said this, then he moved on to this, and then he talked about this, and then he ended by saying we should all plant trees. List summaries, you don't really get into their argument and what they are saying. You just kind of repeat back. And especially for shorter articles, we don't want these because you could just read the original article. We want to get into what they say and how that relates to what you say or what you think. Sometimes summaries can be used. I know the book did qualify this as well because you're actually talking about a full book or an academic journal that's 30 pages long. And you might say, overall, their argument is this, and they break it down to these 5 categories, which is very common with academic journals and articles. They always try to break things down into categories or subcategories. So lists might be able to be used in that way, but we really want to avoid the list of, well, first they say this, then they say that, then they talk about this, and then they end here. Because that is not a good summary. It's just listing what the article talks about. Overall, so we talked about what a bad summary might do. What should a solid or a good summary talk about? Well, you should provide an accurate summary of the original text or the author that you are reading. And this is unbiased. It always is unbiased. However, you want to make sure you tie it into what you are trying to argue about as the writer. And this is where that biased or slanted or spin, that focus, all those words that they use come into play, that it relates to your own claim. So, like I said, going back to my tree example, where they talk about a variety of trees, planting them should help the environment. Well, like I said, I could talk about specifically maybe the pine tree. So I could relate all of their arguments to how, well, actually, the pine tree is the best tree to plant. Not just any tree. I should talk about the pine tree. Or like the previous example I used, where they're talking about the environmental benefits of planting trees. And then I also tie that into the financial benefits. So, they might talk about how planting trees, they provide clean, breathable oxygen, which make our lives better. And then I might say also they provide shade. Not only do they include our quality of life, but they also improve the... They provide shade and improve the efficacy of our energy usage. So you'll use less energy both in the summer and even the winter because they block winds, and in the summer they provide shade. So financially, it's a good investment to plant trees. So you can kind of see, I've given two examples of how I might take an original argument, planting trees are good for the environment, and here's why, and slant it in multiple different ways. And I could slant it, like I said, towards financial benefits. I could slant it towards specifically talking about a single type of tree that I think is the best tree ever. And there's a number of different other ways you can go and talk about things that are then interesting to your argument. A footnote that they do add in the book that I will also talk about briefly is that they talk about satirical summaries. And those are also possible. We know that a lot thanks to The Onion these days, or the Babylon Bee. They do a lot of satirical headlines and do satirical articles. You'll even see them sometimes on bigger platforms like BuzzFeed. I think the WAPO, Washington Post, and even New York Times picked up on this trend a while back. It was a trend of like 20 reasons why Spain is the worst, or 30 reasons never to go to Greece. And then each of the reasons was like, reason number one, the food is just awful. And then it was a photo of just the most delicious cuisine you could ever imagine. And then it was like the scenery is nothing to write home about. And then it was a beautiful, gorgeous, multi-dimensional sunset, looking over a beautiful coastal city. So that kind of satire has become a lot more popular these days. However, once again, sometimes satire can be used in a more biting or intentional way. Our book does this as well, because there might be an argument that leaves a lot unsaid or implies a lot. And then using satire can reveal these flaws and assumptions in a very acerbic way. So one of the articles this chapter talks about is why you should not get a degree in the liberal arts, why it's a waste of time, a waste of money. And one of the points the author makes is that you should leave the liberal arts degrees for the wealthy, and the poor people should just get degrees that are practical, because then we'll leave all the idea creating to the wealthy and all of the enacting of the ideas to the poor. This is not what the author believes at all, because it's very satirical. But it's showing a gap in an argument that says people should not be focusing on liberal arts degrees. They should be focusing on more practical degrees with their college education. People are only saying that to those that have to take out loans or who can't afford to pay out of pocket for degrees. They're not telling people with money or upper class wealthy people that they should get practical degrees in welding or nursing, right? So the author in that article is trying to point out a hole that is implied in this argument that we should not get liberal arts degrees. We should focus on more practical degrees, because that implication is only for the working class. It's not for upper class that can afford to get a degree in whatever they choose to do. It also points out that liberal arts degrees are very important, because people in liberal arts degrees tend to go into fields where there's a lot of decision making happening. So it kind of points out even two flaws in the original argument. So satire, it's important to know, that doesn't come up as often, but it is important to know how to summarize satire effectively as well. Now, the last portion of the chapter is focused on signal verbs, or strong action verbs that help to introduce the summary. So much like we introduce a quote, when we introduce a summary, we also have to use signal phrases and words and verbs that indicate that these are somebody else's ideas that we are commenting on, that we are supporting, that we are working against, that we are verifying, that we are doing a lot of different things too. And our book does a really great job. It lists 4 categories, and it lists a number of verbs within those categories that help us to introduce these summaries. So This is a really brief review for some of you. It might be new information for others of you, but signal and action verbs all break down into one basic function. They link the noun and the complete thought. So you have a noun, every sentence has a noun, every sentence is a verb, and every sentence has a complete thought. Now, that being said, we can construct those sentences in different ways that make them more or less interesting, more or less informative. So we have this type of signal or action verb that is stronger than just a verb with less meaning. So for example, the car hit the deer. Hit is our verb here, and it lets us know that the car hit the deer. Not that the deer hit the car, right? However, there's a lot of information we don't know. How fast did this car hit the deer? There's a lot of information another verb could provide us other than hit. Now, we get into trouble because we sometimes will use the passive construction, or we'll use a to-be verb, is, was, are, and then have our verb as well. So an example of this is the car was hit by the deer. This changes who is doing the action. So now the car is the passive participant in this sentence, and the deer is doing the hitting. So we'll see a lot of passive construction. Sometimes it's just by accident. Sometimes it's intentional, especially when you get into legal matters, right? Which car hit what? The red car was hit by the blue car. That indicates that the blue car did all of the hitting, right? The red car was just the innocent victim, and the red car did all the hitting. So that structure can be used very intentionally to assign blame or assign action. But a lot of times we use it as an afterthought, and it really weakens the verb, right? It weakens how the action occurred, and sometimes also causes confusion, right? So compared to the previous sentence, the car was hit by the deer is weaker than our verb in the first sentence, which is already a weak verb to begin with, right? So we watered down that first sentence even more. Now, lastly, we have a stronger action verb that also kind of signals more information. The car slammed into the deer. So it lets us know velocities, like how fast. It's a slam. It's not a hit. It's not a rolled into the deer. So it gives us a little more information than our previous verb. So how does this then relate to the signal verbs? Well, a lot of times we fall into a pattern of speech that is natural to us, and we don't tend to introduce our summaries and our ideas in a very strong manner. So our book gives us a whole list of verbs that we should be using to introduce summaries, but also introduce other people's ideas to help us get in on this action. We don't want to just say he says, she argues, they believe, the author writes. That's very passive. That's very weak. We want to start getting in on what actually our author is arguing about. It's very easy to say, well, first he says this, then he says that, and then he ends here. What's harder, and what our chapter really wants us to do with summary, is to talk more about their arguments. So instead of he says this, and then he goes on to say this, you summarize and say the key argument that the author upholds or presents or supports is this, and then you list their argument. Because then this also opens the door for debate. It also opens the door for the argument to be expanded upon by your own ideas, and it really helps us enter the conversation. And then once again, these words also help us really transition between words that are not our own, aka what they say, and then transition back to our own words and arguments, or what I say.